So, hello and welcome to the latest in the Leaders with Ambition podcast series. And today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome my guest, Kevin Hogarth. Now, Kevin has had an illustrious career as a CPO over many years in some of the world's largest professional services and financial services firms. And more recently, he's pivoted in his career into mentorship, NED roles, and also real advocate for some charity work and also for some ED&I specialist work as well. Picked up some NED roles along the way, so lots of things for us to discuss today. Kevin was also named by HR Magazine one of the most influential practitioners in 2022. So congratulations for that, Kevin. And he's been actively involved in ED&I since very early on in his career, which again is something that I'd really like us to explore today. It's something that I know he's very passionate about, which I think goes back to his childhood and upbringing in the Northeast, and this real belief that was instilled in him from his family around fairness and social conscience, which again, I think has really resonated throughout his career. So without further ado, Kevin, over to you to bring your career history to life for us.
Great. Thank you very much, Nikki. Thank you for the invitation to join you and for those very, very kind comments. The first thing I would say is I think I've been incredibly fortunate. I've had a fabulous career. I have enjoyed virtually everything that I have done in my career, and there aren't very many people, I think, who can say that. So I feel very privileged to have had such a great career, and to have fallen into something out of university that I really enjoyed. And also, found that actually I was quite good at. And I know that many people, can take a few years to find their sort of career path, what it is that they really enjoy. And I feel very fortunate that, I came to the world of HR quite young, quite early, straight as a fresh-faced graduate, and have enjoyed, a long career working with some amazing people. Absolutely, feel very privileged to have had that.
So when you were growing up, Kevin in Whitley Bay, did you always think, this is it, I'm going to build this career in not necessarily HR, as you say, you fell into that a little bit, but was it always something that you were focused on and wanted to achieve? What happened?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm not sure that as a young kid, many kids know what HR is about. My dad was a civil engineer. My mother was a librarian. I had a pretty nice middle class upbringing. Went to local state schools, but I always, from quite a young age, I had. You mentioned it. So from somewhere came this sense of the world being an unfair place and wanting to do something to make it fairer. And I had at quite a young age, I developed an interest in politics, for example. And I wasn't exactly a geeky child because I played a lot of sports. I was always outside, very outdoorsy sort of upbringing, always on the beach or out in the hills in Northumberland. But I did get interested in politics, and I came to realise that actually the politics I was most drawn to were the politics that were talking about trying to create a fairer and more equal world. And as I grew up, I realised that there was this thing called social conscience, and about if you are, as I thought I was, somebody who was pretty fortunate in life, that people like me had a responsibility to try and support those that were less fortunate in life. And I think that probably has sort of been something that's been reflected through my career. And when I look back now, I'm not sure I always thought about it this way, but when I look back now, I do think about my career as about creating fairer workplaces, where people can thrive, they can make the most of their abilities, regardless of who they are and their background. So, my interest in HR, came later in life, but I always was interested in this concept of how I could make a difference to the world and make the world a fairer place.
Which is, again, at a young age, quite unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Now, I guess I got some of that from my family. I wouldn't say my family were, particularly political. I mean, it wasn't like we sat around the dinner table having political conversations every night, like some political families. Yeah. My parents were never involved in politics or anything anything like that. But I think that, they that was their view of the world as well. And my grandparents on my mother's side, certainly weren't very well off, and I think that probably also shaped my view, seeing what their life had been like. A pretty tough life for them without very much money, and my mother's upbringing was influenced by that. So I'm sure that shaped some of my thinking. But I have to say, again, I wouldn't want to create this picture that that's what my childhood was all about. Because, as I say, I was playing lots of sports, very outdoors lifestyle, and a very, very happy childhood growing up in the northeast. And then we moved with my dad's job to the East Midlands, to Nottingham, where I had my secondary school education again. Continued, very sporty, involved in lots of things at school, and I did play lots and lots of sports. But the one that I sort of excelled at was probably badminton, and I got to quite a good standard in that. I played for the county, and my poor old dad had to drive me and my brother, who was also a very good badminton player, who's 2 years younger than me. He ended up driving us all around the country on weekends to play in county matches, as Nottinghamshire versus Yorkshire, or Nottinghamshire versus Staffordshire, or wherever. And sport has always been, a very central part of my life. My dad was a very good footballer. My mother was very sporty. She played tennis and she played netball. So that's always been a part of my life as well.
Which I think is interesting is, you look at your coaching element now, which I know that you're heavily involved in. I think one of the things you mentioned to me was that when you were at university and you were coaching badminton, that actually the skill set that you learnt there is seen you through quite a lot of your career, hasn't it?
Well, yeah, it's strange, isn't it? Because I saw this advertisement when this was my first Christmas break at university. And so I was playing for the university team at badminton. I saw at the sports centre an advertisement for the courses to qualify as a badminton coach, and I thought, I quite fancied that. I'd sort of helped a bit when I was sort of getting older at school in the school badminton club, with the young kids there. So I had a little bit of exposure to it, but I thought, I think I quite fancy doing that. And so I did do my coach qualifications, and so I was a coach at 18 years old, which is quite young to be a qualified sports coach. But when I think back, I think a lot of the principles I learned there then around how to coach people to play a sport have definitely influenced the way that I think about coaching and developing people and helping them make the most of the ability that they have through the rest of my career. And if you read many of the coaching books, a lot of what they reflect in those books is based on sports coaching and sport and sports psychology and things like that. So that's where I think some of my interest in that came from. And then I did a politics degree, unsurprisingly, given my interest in politics. But as I was thinking about what sort of job I wanted to do, I was very people orientated. But I was also very interested because of the time that this was. This was a time when Thatcher was reforming the trade unions. And I realised that the part of an organisation that dealt with trade unions was the personnel department, as it was called then. And so as I finished my studies and I started applying for jobs, that's what I did. I had a bit of an argument with my dad about whether or not I was going to go travelling or not. He wasn't very keen on that idea, having paid for me to go through university. He thought he thought I could better go out there and earn a living. So I did a deal with him, and I would accept a job if I got offered one, but wouldn't just keep on going if I didn't get one from the milk round. And I did. I got offered a job in the personnel department, in the training department actually, at Boots, their head office.
Which is Nottingham again. It's really fascinating with the connection with Nottingham, which I know will continue throughout your story as well, doesn't it?
It does. Having moved there with my dad's job and secondary school education, I wasn't particularly looking to go back to Nottingham, but that's the only place I got. I was offered a job, so I did go back there and spent 5 great years there. Very grateful to Boots for the sort of foundational experience that I got. I had some great managers. When I think back to the managers I had in those early stages of my career, again, I feel very fortunate for the care and the attention that they took to my development, giving me new opportunities. I mean, I was a bit of an agitator, for new opportunities. I'd be doing something for 18 months and I'd be going, right, okay, what's next? I want to do something. Because I was ambitious. I did want to get on. But that ambition, somebody once said to me, "Oh, you're very competitive, Kevin." And I certainly was competitive when I was playing sports, but I never really thought of myself as competitive at work, because I want everybody to be successful at work. And certainly I kind of thought that this description of me as competitive was that I wanted to win at the expense of other people. That was never the case. I very much wanted everybody in the team to succeed, the organisation to succeed. But yes, I was ambitious. I did want to become more senior. I saw that the way that you influenced what was going on in an organisation was by getting into more senior jobs, and I think that is what was driving me. I did want to influence what happened and be involved in the decisions about what was going on. And if you wanted to do that, you had to get into the managers' jobs and the senior managers' jobs and so on. And so I got a few promotions at Boots. Eventually, I got a recruitment and development manager job. I had a team of about 5. My first sort of experience of managing a proper team. And I really enjoyed managing people. And I know some people find that they don't really enjoy that, but I did. I really enjoyed the opportunity to sort of work on motivating people, helping them solve problems, think about what it was that we were trying to do as a team, build a team spirit. All of that was stuff that actually I really enjoyed, and that has been a feature ever since, that I've actually really enjoyed being a leader of people, being alongside the satisfaction that I had from my professional work as an HR professional. Just that bit about being a leader of teams has been very, very satisfying.
And how important, you mentioned there, that every year, 18 months, you'd be saying, what's next? How important is that? Because, there's a two-way thought process, isn't there? One is, you will do your job and things come to you. And the other is you go out there and ask for it, because no one's going to give you anything unless you do. So where do you sit in there?
Well, I think you've got to avoid making yourself a pain in the butt by constantly going on about it. And you do have to sort of match what you're asking for with delivering results. So you have to know that you're sort of getting to grips with what you're doing and you're doing that job quite well, before, so going and asking for the next thing. But I do think you need to go and ask, and do need to think that if you want to progress in your career, you need to make it clear what it is that you're looking for, what type of experiences you want. And certainly I wasn't shy in doing that. But that was probably a product of having, I think, some really good managers in those early years. I felt very comfortable talking to them about that. And they encouraged me to talk about that. And so, again, I think that's something that I've always adopted in my conversations with people. I've never got upset when people have started to tell me that they think they're outgrowing the job or they're outgrowing the organisation and they're thinking about making a move. I'd much prefer to have that discussion with them. One, because it may well be that actually there is something I can do to create an opportunity for them within the organisation that maybe from their vantage point they can't see, but I can. Yeah. But equally, if it's the right thing for them to do to move on, then ultimately I would want to help them in doing that.
Yeah, I know it's one of the things that you say, it's one of the highlights of your career, isn't it? It's being able to see people progressing, developing and stepping on to create these stellar careers.
Absolutely. When I think back at some of the most satisfying periods of my career, it has been when I've had a great team of people who are all chomping at the bit to do more things, and to get on and progress. And now when I look back and I think about, the contributions I've made in creating opportunities for people who go on to have great careers themselves, that's one of the most hugely satisfying aspects of my career. More satisfying than I put in place a great succession planning process at this organisation. It's the fact that I now look at some people and the positions that they're in and think, well, I think I did play a part in helping develop them into a position where they could go on and do those sorts of roles.
And development, I know, is important to you personally as well as for your teams. And you got headhunted towards the end of your time at Boots, didn't you? And were offered an opportunity to start.
Yes, I did. This is a bit unusual, getting headhunted, as I don't quite know how that happened. But anyway, I did. I got a phone call, and I had no idea how they knew who I was. But I'd always again thought that I wanted, in the early stage of my career, to get different experiences. And so, it was a bit of a pattern emerging as I talked to you, Nikki, around I was thoughtful about my career. I was thoughtful about what experiences I needed within Boots, and then I was thoughtful about what I needed, how long I wanted to stay with Boots, and then about what I wanted to do afterwards. And I knew I wanted to go and do something different. I wanted to go and work in a different sector. And I think I'm very fortunate being in HR, and the HR skills are quite portable. Particularly earlier on in your career, it's much easier to move sectors in a function like HR than it is in some other areas. And so, yes, it was financial services. It was a really exciting time in financial services. A lot of reforms, deregulation of financial institutions. And I joined a building society, Southern's largest building society at the time, called National and Provincial, who were saying that they were going to follow Abbey National, and they were going to demutualise and become a PLC. That sounded interesting, to be part of all of the change that went on. When I arrived, within a few months, it became apparent that actually the market conditions weren't really going to allow that. And the chief executive left. That was his strategy. And as is so often the case, when one strategy fails, the chief executive leaves. So a new chief executive came in and made a huge difference to the organisation. He wasn't from financial services. He was actually a chief executive at Rank Xerox. And he brought with him a lot of management, Japanese management thinking, which was very much in vogue at that time. This was the late 80s. So things like quality circles, an approach to continuous improvement, process management, and this was stuff I'd never ever encountered. And that was certainly one of the periods of my career where I think I learned most and learned really quickly from the new people that were coming into the organisation. David brought a number of people in to help him change the organisation. And I was surrounded by some really very talented HR people. And again, because of a reorganisation, I got another great opportunity to become the head of HR for the branch network, which was the sort of biggest operational job in the building society. And it was the one that I had wanted when I knew this reorganisation was coming up. I was perhaps a little bit surprised to get it, and I would say it's an example of learning a lot, but learning a lot because I wasn't very good. It was
best time to learn, isn't it?
Yeah, it was a pretty painful first year in that role, because I probably was a bit inexperienced, a bit naive, and so I learned very quickly, and quite a few battle scars from things that didn't go very well in my first year. And I remember my boss saying to me, "Well, the chief executive has told me I should be moving you on, but I've told him I think you've got potential. I want to give you a chance." So that really made me determined to make a go of it. And I did manage to turn it around, and I ended up staying at the building society for about 8 years. The irony is we were eventually acquired by Abbey National, whose sort of strategy we were going to follow. They came and acquired us, and so I moved across to Abbey National, but didn't. For the first time in my career, I didn't really enjoy what I was doing. That was a very new experience for me, and that was predominantly because of the culture. Again, National Provincial NMP had been a very progressive HR environment with new approaches to people management, and I felt as though I was taking a step back and doing some very, very traditional type of personnel management stuff with Abbey National. So I thought, I probably do need to move on from here, and to take what I'd learned at NMP and to apply that into other organisations. And that's when again I was approached for a job at Ernst & Young, or EY as they're known these days, And that was my sort of first foray into professional services, which obviously was then going to become a bit of a feature of the next phase of my career. And again, I was thinking, well, it's very different, business to business rather than business to consumer. It's a professional partnership. I've never worked in an environment like that. And so I was attracted again by the fact that I'd be learning about a different sector. And I felt also, given what I was hearing about EY through the interviews, that this was an organisation that wanted to raise its game on HR. And I felt, I can bring the experience that I got from the building society into EY.
But I do love how you're carefully thinking and planning. You're trying to ensure that you have maximum exposure to all different kinds of businesses, and you're making decisions based on that as well, and also looking at how can I help take this business forward. It's not just about you adapting and developing your own skill set. So you walked into EY and I would imagine then it wasn't as advanced as some of the HR work that you've been doing previously.
No, it wasn't. I mean, I think the professional services at that time hadn't really got to grips with what good HR looks like. I think they're very different today than they were.
Great opportunity for you, as you say, though, with all your knowledge and skills.
Yeah, and that was part of the attraction, was to be able to put some of that into practice. But I having struggled at the start of my time when I got the head of HR role for the branch network at NMP, I struggled when I joined a professional services firm because of how different it is working in a partnership and working in a corporate. And I really didn't give that enough thought about how different it was going to be. And I'd probably been there about a year when one of the office managing partners took me to one side and gave me some feedback, and he was pretty much saying, I don't think it's going very well, Kevin. But again, a bit like my boss at NMP said, I think you've got more to offer. And he spent time really talking to me about how to be successful in a professional services firm and the differences between a partnership and a corporate, and the need to engage in the wider partnership and not just rely on the formal management structures to try and influence things. And it was not quite a light bulb moment, but it certainly made me think differently about the way that I was operating in the firm. And there must have been something there, because I subsequently spent quite a lot of my career in professional services firms, and started to really enjoy it and the engagement with the broader partnership.
And again, it's interesting with that mentorship coaching. Again, you're receiving direct mentorship from a very senior person as well, which can be more unusual. And yet you pay that forward with your teams as well. Is it learned behaviour, or is it the fact that you're so open and ready to absorb that has allowed that to happen?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. I've always been somebody who has found it quite easy to take feedback and listen to feedback. I don't get very defensive. I have always thought it's coming from a good place. Not everybody's very skilled in giving the feedback, so some of it sort of lands a bit more harshly than other feedback. But if you think about the intent behind it, then I've always thought that these people are trying to help me. So listen to what it is that they're saying. Don't be pig-headed and stubborn and think that you know what the right way. Especially with people like this office managing partner who had 20 years more experience than me, and had lived his entire professional life in partnerships, and I'd had 12 months, and so it would have been foolish not to listen to what the advice that he had to give. But I guess I do think that because I've been fortunate in having people like that in my career who have helped guide me, offer me development opportunities. They were my role models. They were the people who I looked at and thought, well, I really admire them. I'm really grateful to them for the help and the support that they provided. And so I guess I incorporated some of that into the way that I was looking to manage and lead my teams as well.
Yeah. Did you have formal training in management as well? Was that something that was part of the way that you were developed?
Yeah, well, that is one of the great foundational things at Boots. I had loads of management training at Boots virtually from the minute I walked through the door, about the fundamentals of management. In those days, they didn't talk so much about leadership; they talked about management mainly, but about the principles of how to be a good manager, how to manage people, how to deal with challenging situations, how to manage my own time, how to plan. All of those fundamental business skills. And I got a lot of training in those first 5 years at Boots. That then definitely continued at the Building Society. I got more training there. So I felt those early years of my career, again, lots of really foundational stuff. I learned lots of really foundational stuff that served me pretty well through the rest of my career.
Yeah, it's those building blocks, isn't it? I think often now you see people go into management roles because they're good at their jobs.
Yes.
And it make you a good leader or a good manager, does it? It's a different kind of skill set that you need. So it's interesting.
Yes. And I think that's perhaps a difference between corporates and professional services firms. In professional services firms, definitely you're getting promoted, because of your technical competence. Yeah. You're a great lawyer, a great accountant, you're great, tax advisor or whatever it is, and you're progressing as a result of that. In a corporate, from quite an early age, when you start to manage people, then a fundamental part of what you're being appraised on is how well you're managing your team, and that was very evident to me. When I started managing people, that was going to be part of my performance objectives. It's what I would be evaluated on, and so I needed to be good at that. And I needed to invest time in building my skills and learning how to be a better manager of people. And that's not always the case in professional services, where perhaps that side of the role is not valued to the same extent as the technical skills.
Very, very true. And you were doing incredibly well at EY, and then you decided it was time to move again because it was business as usual, and Kevin doesn't like that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that happened at EY was I started to get a little taste of international work. Right. So EY UK, obviously part of the kind of broader global EY family. The UK firm, the second largest firm in the EY global network, and so whenever there were global meetings, obviously the UK was attending them. So I was starting to attend global meetings and thinking this is quite interesting, and it's quite interesting. Kind of getting to grips with the way things are done differently in Germany and France, or the United States, or wherever. And I thought, I think I would like a bit more of that. And an opportunity came up at Capital One to be the international recruitment director at a time when Capital One had very expansive international plans. And so I thought, that was part of the attraction, but also it was a very different type of organization to the ones that I previously worked for, where they all had a sort of 100-year plus legacy. Yeah. Capital One had a few years of a legacy because I joined in 2001, and they'd only really been in the UK since 97, but IPO'd in the US in 96. And so it was a very dynamic, entrepreneurial organization that was growing very, very quickly, where we were putting policies in place for the first time. It wasn't a case of, well, we need to change that policy. It was, well, we need a policy, or we need a process. And also, it was an organization that valued people. And wanted to be really exceptional in terms of its culture and the way in which people were managed and developed. So when they were looking to develop something, they would go and look at the world's great corporations. They go and look at GE. They go and look at Ford. They go and look at organizations who had a reputation of being best in class in people management, and then try and synthesize what they had done to apply it into Capital One. And I'd say again that was a period of really quite intense professional development for me, and learning about what really great HR looks like. And I think a lot of my career since has been, even though that's getting to be quite a long time ago now, it's 20 years ago that I was at Capital One. Much of what I learned there still does influence, and has influenced my thinking about the way I wanted to go about running HR teams in the organizations that I went into subsequently. I loved Capital One. I got a promotion there to be the European HR director, team of about 50 people. I really, really loved it. It was fantastic culture, great people, great colleagues, and I'm still, firm friends with many of the people that I worked with there. But this organisation that was growing incredibly quickly, things changed, and Capital One is a subprime lender, and the winds of the winds of the global financial crisis were first felt in the subprime market in the United States, and Capital One started to retrench. They had a change of strategy and were investing very heavily in building a branch network in the United States, and so there was less investment for the international businesses. And we went through, in the UK, a very, very significant business transformation program. We outsourced large parts of the operation and reduced the headcount quite dramatically, to the point really where they didn't really need people like me and some of my other executive colleagues at that level of seniority running the business. So I agreed that I would see through the business transformation, and then I would move on and look for another opportunity. And
well, again, a really interesting period of time there, Kevin. You're going through that, as you say, this business transformation during a GFC, which was, up until COVID, one of the most extreme periods of time that we've seen in our lives. So again, you're learning all the time, aren't you?
Oh no, absolutely, because you've gone from being in an organisation that's growing very quickly to in a very entrepreneurial phase of its development, to one that then had to mature very quickly. The regulators started taking a great interest in the organisation because it had become such a size, and many of the internal processes and policies weren't really quite robust enough for an organisation of the scale that Capital One had become. So we had to become a bit more internally focused rather than externally focused for a period of time. Then we go through into the period leading up into the global financial crisis of this business transformation. So there were several. One of the interesting things there is I went through several iterations of the management team, of the executive team. The executive team that when I had joined the business, it was a very, very different executive team to the team later on in my time with the firm, which sort of reflected the different skills that were needed as the needs of the business were changing. And of course, as the HR person, I was centrally involved in working with the 3 or 4 CEOs that I worked with during that time in reshaping those executive teams. So again, fantastic experience. And learning an enormous amount. But I think when I was thinking about what do I want to do next after Capital One, I had enjoyed it so much that I thought it's going to be very hard to replicate this. And so, when opportunities came up to go and talk to other financial services organisations, I thought, I'm not sure that I want to do that because it'll be more of the same, but probably not quite as good. And so I was looking for fresh challenge. I was looking for somewhere where I thought I could take what I'd learned at Capital One and apply that. And that's when the Freshfields job came up. And my former colleagues at Freshfields would be horrified to know I hadn't even heard of who Freshfields were. I'd heard of Slaughter and May, and I'd heard of Linklaters and Allen and Overy, but I actually hadn't heard of Freshfields. So I had to Google them to find out, and realise that they were a pretty significant law firm. And as I talked to them, and I had a lot of interviews on my way into Freshfields with lots of partners. I got a sense that they really were up for trying to modernise their people practices, and they recognised that they needed to be much better at people management, people development, talent management, all that sort of stuff, and also things like diversity and inclusion, which they hadn't spent very much time thinking about. It was a professional services firm, and I think that probably why I got the job was because they were looking for somebody who brought some external experience, but you knew how a partnership worked. And so I think I was kind of a slightly safer bet. And it was unbelievably different to Capital One. But I really did enjoy my time at Freshfields again. I think that it was hard work. building the business case for all the changes that we wanted to make, things like diversity and inclusion, trying to demonstrate that what was going on in the organization wasn't really a merit-based system, because I think a lot of partners at the time thought, where it's a fair firm, we promote on merit, we take the best people, and the best of the best emerge as partners. But I think over time we're able to get them to think a little bit more deeply about the fact that there were a number of groups that weren't very well represented in the partnership. Why was that? What was getting in the way, for example, of women coming through into partnership, and what could we do to stop the waste of talent? So I started doing some EDI work at Capital One. The Americans were pretty progressive in that arena, and then really it was one of the very first things that I got involved with at Freshfields in building the business case for the firm's first ever diversity and inclusion strategy. And of course, that all going back to where we started the conversation, Nikki, that some of my personal values and that sort of sense of fairness. I thought what went on in organisations was very unfair, in that there were many talented people who didn't get the opportunities that they should do. That there were barriers placed in the way of women, ethnic minorities, and other underrepresented groups. That meant that they didn't progress in a way in which their abilities actually warranted. And so I was very committed to trying to level the playing field so those talented people could come through. And I look back on my time at Freshfields with great pride about what we were able to accomplish during that time. And I think I could well have stayed at Freshfields for even longer. I often reflect on the fact that when you work in a professional partnership, your influence tends to grow over time, because you build relationships and you build institutional knowledge. And people learn to trust you, and
it takes a lot of time, doesn't it, in a professional setting?
It does. It takes time, and in a corporate, I think it's a little bit different. Often, your maximum influence in a corporate is immediately after you joined. You're the new person. People are expecting you to bring about change. You get in there. You have quite a lot of positional authority in a corporate. As the chief people officer, HR director, whatever your title. There's quite a lot of positional authority, and there's much less positional authority in a professional services firm. So you have to work to influence. That influence grows over time. And so after 8 years, I felt as though I was well respected, had the ear of the partnership, and was influencing what was going on. When I got the opportunity to move to Norton Rose Fulbright, I had again this theme of being thoughtful about my career. Yeah. I had always thought that there would be a final phase of my career where I would go and do some consulting work and coaching work and things like that, and wanted to finish my career doing that. And so I reflected on the fact that I was probably going to equip myself much better if I went and worked in another law firm than just spend another 4 or 5 years working at Freshfields and doing more of the same at Freshfields. I'm sure I would have continued to learn, but I wouldn't have learned as much as I did by going into a very different type of law firm that's operating in a different part of the marketplace. It's a Swiss Verein, so not a globally integrated firm like Freshfields. So very, very, very different. And I learned an awful lot that I think is serving me well now, doing what I'm doing. And I also, back in my time at Capital One, had started doing some unpaid non-exec work. I joined the board of Nottingham Trent University and did several non-exec roles for Scope, the disabled charity. Again, thinking that this is experience that will serve me well if I want to go and do non-exec work in the future. So I thought that Norton Rose Fulbright was going to be my kind of final exec job, and then I'd do the kind of the plural stuff, and I was planning to do that. Peter Marta, who was a global chief executive, who I'd worked very closely with, had announced that he would be serving a final term and would retire in 2020. And I thought that's probably a good time for me to step away. But of course, COVID came along.
COVID, yes.
Yeah, that's right. And two things. One, I got very, very busy because it was an incredibly busy time for everybody in HR dealing with COVID. And also, it just probably wasn't a very good time to go and try and set up my own business as COVID hit. And then I was very, very surprised to be approached about the KPMG UK Chief People Officer role, and even more surprised than when I got offered it. And I thought, actually, that's a great job, fantastic firm. I'm going to refresh my knowledge of the Big Four by moving in to the KPMG role. It had been sort of 20 years or so since I've been at EY. And again, I was thinking, well, that will equip me with a different set of skills and knowledge for when I do my plural stuff. And I joined during COVID. So, I joined, and I was there for about 9 months or so before I met, any of my colleagues. But it was obviously a very, very challenging time for everybody in HR. And I remember talking to somebody and then telling me that the global financial crisis had been the CFO's crisis, sort of helping organizations, particularly financial services institutions, through the GFC. The CFO was very much at the forefront of that. But COVID was the chief people officer's crisis. It pushed the CPOs to the forefront. They were often the spokespeople. They were the leaders. It was all about how we get the people in the organisation, how we keep them safe, how we continue to run the business with all the challenges that COVID presented. And I think we saw during that crisis the HR teams in all organisations really step up to the plate and contribute incredibly well to helping organisations through that crisis.
That resonates so much, doesn't it? And you can see, I know that with our HR manager at the time, we were just looking at her saying, what happened?
What do we do? Absolutely. And interestingly, professionally, it was very challenging, but interesting at the time, because there was no playbook. There wasn't anything that you could go and say, well, this is the way you manage through a global pandemic, because we hadn't had to do it before. And so, it was a period of time where it really did. HR teams had to be very responsive, very, very flexible, very agile in order to respond to the changing situation. I'm incredibly proud about how the whole of the HR profession responded to the challenge that COVID presented to organisations right across not just the UK but right across the world. But as I got back into as COVID sort of started to subside, I started to think that some of the routine of being a global chief people officer, the UK chief people officer, that I wasn't getting the same enjoyment and satisfaction from it.
It's only the second point in your career that you've not had that, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's right. So so it was an unusual experience for me to think I'm not enjoying this quite as much as I would like to, and so my thoughts started to return to a plural career, and I decided that I would take the step out of take that step away from an executive role and move into a world where I would be doing some coaching. I'll be doing some non-executive work and doing some consulting and advisory work. So that's what I've been working on building since I left KPMG last September.
And you're talking about that advisory space for you, which is something you've done continuously throughout your career. So it's not too much of a step to one side. It's just for maybe a few different companies as opposed to one firm. What is it that gives you your passion around that? What is it that drives you?
I think it's the same as it was, being in-house in an HR role. It's around making a difference. It's around making organisations better, fairer places, ones where really they can make the most of the talent that they have within the organisation. So most of the work that I'm doing and I want to do is really around talent, around EDI, leadership development, that sort of work. And so you're right. It's largely doing some of the work that I used to do, but doing it for other organisations. I've had to get used to doing some things differently. I have to do business development these days, so I have to get out and win work from clients. So that is a bit different, but it's for the purpose of. And actually, I wouldn't say that I don't particularly enjoy business development, because I love talking to people, and I'm very curious about them, and I'm very curious about their organisations. And actually, I think that's the key to great business development. If you show great curiosity about people and about their organisations, they tell you all sorts of stuff that gives you great insight into where you might actually be able to help them.
Yeah,
absolutely. Rather than going in with a predetermined idea about, actually, I'm going to go in and sort of sell myself as a EDI expert. They may need EDI support, but let's have a conversation around what's going on and see where it is that I can contribute. So actually, I've really enjoyed that, getting out and talking to people about their businesses and learning about different organisations.
So talking about ED&I, because I know it's something that, as you say, you started doing a lot more work around when you're at Capital One, and were able to keep developing and morphing that. How are you getting people? How did you get people to buy into that? You're in a partnership, which is more traditional in the way that they work, and as you say, they already felt they were in a meritocracy, which, as you pointed out, that wasn't necessarily the case. How did you get people to buy in, and how do you continue to do that?
Well, I think it's at that point, I think it was a lot about the business case and about data. And so putting data in front of the partners that showed them what happens, for example, to the women that join the organisation, at a 50-50 ratio on training contracts at entry level into the organisation. And let's look at what's happened to them after 5 years into their career. Where have they all gone? What's happened, and showing them data about how that the attrition through the career stages in the organisation. Some qualitative data, so not just quantitative data, but qualitative data. So focus groups with women, talking about their experience of the firm, which I think was quite sobering for many of my leadership colleagues, hearing the firm that they loved, that they were passionate about. That they thought, this is one of the preeminent law firms in the world, and then to hear the stories about the experience that some women were having in the firm. Some of it was, behaviour was on a spectrum, from behaviour that really was very, very poor behaviour, to some which today we describe as unconscious bias, microaggressions, and things like that, but nonetheless still had an impact on women and how they felt about the firm and how inclusive the firm was, and whether it was a place that they felt that they could be successful and develop their careers. And so, at that point, it was I know many of the women in the firm felt that we should be making the case just on, well, it's the right thing to do, and if you look at the values of the organisation, then this is something that we should just be accepting is issue of gender equality. I did focus mainly on the business case. Now, I actually think that in the work that I and others do in the EDI space, there's room for both. And I've learned that, of course, there are different leaders, there are different levers, and some are actually persuaded by the sort of moral, social case of creating a fairer world, a fairer society, creating opportunities for underrepresented groups, about the alignment to the organisation's values. There are leaders that are, fully behind that, and that is their motivation for what they want to do. And there's other leaders where it's, well, show me how this is going to benefit us financially. Yeah. And of course, I and others who operate in the EDI field are quite fortunate now. There's so much research that demonstrates the commercial impact that more diverse and inclusive organisations, the better business results that they enjoy. It's quite hard when you sort of order all of that evidence for people to stand in the way. So so I did it principally through sort of working hard on the business case, looking at the data, qualitative and quantitative, to put in front of the partners to persuade them that we needed to do something.
And I know that you did set up allyship groups as well, which is so important, isn't it? Because again, you're looking at things through a lens, and you're obviously looking at it through a lens from coming from a really positive place. But unless you're actually in that situation, living and breathing, it's not always as easy to understand.
Well, people can contribute in so many different ways, and I think the role of allies is very, very important. I do think that as a white man, trying to understand more about the experience of my female colleagues and understanding more about the experience of colleagues who come from ethnic minority background, it's really important. And then I need to stand side by side with them and argue the case for change. And the system that we operate in organisations has been designed predominantly by white men, and it favours white men. And actually, it's up to white men largely to change that system, to recognise the privilege that they have, and to accept that needs to change. That they need to move to a position where they won't enjoy the privilege that they've had in the past. But that is what it means to create a truly diverse and inclusive organisation where people from all backgrounds with their talents can actually flourish, and that the majority group doesn't create an environment where it perpetuates the conditions for the success of the majority group.
Yeah. I think it's interesting when you and I have spoken before, when we talked about Edie and I, and in your role in a global capacity as well, the challenges that different cultures, different countries face, it's so different. And again, you being able to pull all that together is challenging itself, isn't it?
The global piece is really hard because gender sort of transcends boundaries. But when you start to talk about issues of race, ethnicity, culture, what that means in the UK is very different to what it means in France, to what it means in Germany, to what it means in Australia or Canada or the United States. And so having to work within an understanding that national context is really very important, because that piece is different. But that fundamental principle of this is about fairness, well, that doesn't change, because if you look at the challenges of Indigenous people in Australia, First Nations people in Canada, well, it's about fairness.
Yeah. If
you look at some of the issues that LGBT plus colleagues face in some parts of the world, well, it's about fairness. And so, to me, that's been the central tenets of the work that I've done in the EDI space. This is about creating a fairer organisations, and by creating fairer organisations that will have an influence on the society in which we live.
So, Mum and Dad Hogarth did well instilling that fairness into you at a young age.
Well, my parents, I'm very grateful to my parents. Only my dad left around these days, but they gave me a really, really, I think, a good upbringing. As I said earlier, very happy childhood, and I think that they instilled some decent values into me. That's certainly what I tried to do with my kids. But I'm just feel very fortunate to have had a career where I've been in a position to be able to influence things in a way that I hope I've left places, better than they were when I arrived.
Which is great. And interesting question I'd like to ask you is about networking as well, because it's something I would imagine you've had to do throughout your career, is build this network and really utilise it. And is that something that you've been very conscious about, or has that happened as you've evolved as well and your career's evolved?
I think I've been very conscious of building a network, of wanting to keep in touch with it. I think it started out really as wanting to keep in touch with people who I used to work with. I didn't really think about it as networking, but so I'd always keep in touch with them, and they'd obviously go off in different directions in their career, and it was nice to catch up with them and find out what they were doing. And again, as I said earlier, I'm a naturally curious person. And so I was always keen when people wanted to meet with me. I thought, it'd be interesting to chat to them and find out what they're doing, what their organisation does. And I think it was probably at EY where I started to think about networking. There's this concept of networking. And I heard the partners talk a lot about it in the context of business development, the need to build their network for business development purposes. But I recognized that actually that applied equally to the type of work that I was doing, and the ability to be able to tap into the expertise of people outside of the organization, to ask them for advice and insights and referrals to other people who knew about particular topics that I was interested in. And also, quite shamelessly, I also was thinking about when I get to this stage of my career, and that it would be my network that would help sustain an advisory and consulting and coaching, mentoring career, and so that I've always invested time in that. Now, it's become a lot easier with the advent of things like LinkedIn and such like to keep in touch with people. But I do also think that I am now reaping the benefits of probably being quite generous with my time with people when they've asked for my advice and my help. That I've found people incredibly generous in accepting lunch meetings with me, coffee meetings, when I've wanted to pick their brains about how do you do this plural stuff, and who else should I go and talk to. People have been so kind, so generous. But I think there is, again, a little bit of, if you do that during your career for other people, you do get repaid in kind later on in your career.
I do think it's investing in your network. And as you say, it's quite easy to have a LinkedIn network with thousands of people on it. But do you actually have a relationship with those people? And that's the investment into it.
Yeah.
So what would you class as being your challenges throughout your career, Kevin? Because you've spoken about lots today.
Yes. Well, certainly I've talked about some of the things where I've had points in my career where I found it difficult, and they were both occasions where I changed organisations or got a bigger job, and they have been challenges in getting to a position where I felt I was contributing to the level that I wanted to. But undoubtedly, the whole for the last 10, 15 years, this whole area of EDI has been a constant theme and a constant challenge, and been hard work to make the progress. I think the progress that we've achieved over the last 10 or 15 years has been really hard won, and so that has been a challenge. It's always a challenge when you have a dysfunctional leadership team. And I have worked with dysfunctional leadership teams where there are personal relationships that aren't very, very good, or there are differences of views about the way the organisation ought to be going, and that makes it very hard. And I think particularly in the type of role that chief people officers perform, if you haven't got a leadership team that is fully aligned, so that's always been challenging when that's been the case. And then I would also say that actually probably what we touched on earlier, COVID was probably the most challenging. And it came quite late in my career, but I can't think of anything that has challenged me more than trying to help. It was two organisations, because I started COVID in Norton Rose Fulbright, and right at the very start, we had to cancel a Global Partners Conference when we were already in. A group of us were already in Austin, in Texas. 48 hours away from the conference commencing, making a decision on a Monday evening to get on the phones and ring around and try and get a few of the partners on to go on to the planes that they were scheduled to step onto in the next 24 hours to cancel that. And that was really the start of it. I flew back from Austin and didn't step on a plane again for 18 months, and then moved to KPMG during COVID. As no precedents, nobody there to help you with this is the way that we tackled it. Yeah, absolutely. So. And pretty high stakes, because you're talking about keeping people safe and secure. Huge mental health challenges for people during that period. So that is probably the most challenging period of my career, and obviously it's relatively recent.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I know I've talked about the challenging times, but how much you've learned during those periods of times, and that's really positive way of thinking about what are the challenges teaching you, and instead of helping them to let them destroy you, which is not what anybody wants to do, is it?
Well, no, yeah, I mean, you obviously have to be resilient, and very few careers, are going to be sort of gilded careers where you move through without any difficulties at all. So often I think it is that the periods that when it's hardest that you're learning most. You're learning most about yourself, learning most about your skill set and what you're doing. So I do think that's and being reflective and looking back and thinking, what did I learn from that? What would I do? What would I do differently if I was faced with that again? It's really important. And so embrace those periods when it's been difficult and it's been challenging.
And your highlights. What would you class as being your highlights?
Well, I've talked about some of the organisations. Probably Capital One is a highlight in terms of the quality of the HR work that I did, the people, the culture. I probably enjoyed that job more than any other job that I've done. So that is undoubtedly a highlight. Yeah. The people that I've worked with just some amazingly talented people, and particularly those that I've been able to help with their careers and seeing them going on and flourishing. And then probably the contribution that I've made in the EDI space, I think would be the other one, and the progress that we've made, an enormous amount still to do in that arena. But if we think back to where we were 10 or 15 years ago, the world is a different place, and there's a different dialogue, very different expectations of organisations and leadership teams now than there was when we first started talking about this as a business critical topic.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, to think that the strides have been made, which is fantastic. But as you say, there's still a lot to go, still a long way to go. And words of wisdom, Kevin in Whitley Bay growing up, to Kevin moving to Nottingham and having that connection to Nottingham still. What words of wisdom would you give?
I'd say certainly early on in a career, try do some different things, experiment. I experimented by moving into different sectors and doing different things because I was lucky in finding a career that I was enjoying. But if you're doing something that you're not enjoying, change it. Life's far too short, and there are many other opportunities and other things that you'll find. Try and find something that you enjoy, that you can be passionate about. It saddens me so much when I think about the number of people who go to work every day and don't really enjoy what they do, and that's been such a contrast to my experience. So do try different things. And my advice to HR people, actually, and not all of them like to hear this, is I will often say, don't start in HR. Go and get some other experience, particularly if you can get some customer-facing experience, so you know what life is like at the sharp end of an organisation, or step out of HR during your career and go and do that. That's probably the one regret that I have during my career, is I would like to have taken a step out into a line management role and managed, in the business, close to the customers, and that didn't happen. But I think that's great experience, because HR people need to be commercial HR people. They need to understand the business in the same way as everybody else does, and be able to talk the language of everybody else in the business. And that's one of the ways in which you can. One of the ways in which you can do that. And then the other thing is, do spend time thinking, reflecting, thinking about the experiences that you've got, and find people who will help you. We've talked about the sort of people who've helped me along in my career. I would never say that I had a formal mentor, that some one person, but I've just had so many people who have helped me along in my career. So try and find those people who are going to help you in your career.
Well, great advice and words of wisdom to end on there, Kevin, today. So I have to thank you so much for your time. I found the conversation really interesting, and it's been great to talk to you today. Thank you.
Nikki, thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation to talk through those things. I really do appreciate it.
Pleasure.